think we went over. Sorry, I don't know what happened, but we're re-recording now. Okay. I think Scott would be the person to follow up with. He's not piping in, so I'm guessing he's not actively on right now.
Laura, I am. I didn't know if the audio was working.
The audio is working. Go ahead, Scott. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Hey, no worries. We are happy to help facilitate that. I would also, I mean, I'm on the outside here, so I need to be a little careful, but I would challenge the group to think about, is the outcome, I mean, Robert presented some data that suggested that no matter how we look at it, similar conclusions are resolving. I think we should be mindful of continuing to bring more and more and more data in if it's not going to change the conclusion about habitat condition and some of the areas where we need to focus, like we've heard highlighted today. I think it's important to bring that information in. I also think it's important that we start looking forward and saying in terms of what are some of the habitat issues that have been identified and what are the things that we can do to start to make progress, both the passive approaches Sharon was talking about and some of the active approaches that we've heard about with floodplain, reconnecting floodplains, for example.
Thank you, Scott.
I was going to say the other person that was in the state office that was pushing to get all the PFC data entered into the database was Sarah Peterson, and she's now no longer in the state office either. And I don't think they've replaced her. So I'm not sure if there is anybody in the state office who was really bird dogging this question of making sure that all the data we do have is available to us to use for this process.
Alan noted in the chat that he's going to look into it for Nevada.
Right. And just
You're on point, Alan.
Wrap this up, during the same time period or fairly close, we were, also working through the database core team, and it wasn't just Nevada BLM or BLM across the 3 states and PFC specific. We ran into these same challenges with state habitat data and forest and everything on it. So it's one of those needs, and, reinforces that need and importance for the efforts that Leaf and his team is working on with the CED on being able to manage and make that data accessible for all parties here on it. So we got one more question for the Habitat core team. If anybody has anything remaining, otherwise we will move over to Haley to talk about RAD framework. Thanks.
Can we move that up, you think?
This part?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Oh. You can move it down? No. Is that bad or worse?
Oh, no, that's great. That's good. Perfect. Awesome. Thanks. My name is Haley Glassick. I work with Robert based out of USGS in Bozeman, and I am part of the Habitat core team, but today I'm going to be sharing with you the Resist, Accept, Direct framework. And this framework has been created to really start conversations about how we can use all these different data sets in order to understand how we are going to prioritize things on the landscape. And we think that this could be an opportunity to use RAD for LCT, considering the past few days, everyone's work that we've seen. And before I start, I do have a few examples of how RAD is already mapping onto different management actions for LCT, and all the information there, spent a lot of time with Cody and Jacob and Jason and Chad gave me all of that information and provided a lot of pictures and context for that. So I want to thank them for that.
Just quick.
Hi.
And I use the arrows, so it'll be quick.
Okay. So we're all very familiar with this map of LCT habitat, whether it's occupied, suitable, or historical. And I think, one thing that if Sean were here, he did send out that poll, which I think only 10 people were actually able to respond to that poll about, whether thinking about LCT persistence on the landscape or expanding their range to all the suitable habitat is really possible. And, with even in thinking about the historical habitat versus the suitable habitat, we're thinking about accepting certain things on the landscape that we will not be able to overcome. And so in addition to that, right, we have this suitable habitat layer, but there are social aspects that we may need to come up against as we're thinking about prioritizing restoring Lahontan cutthroat trout on the landscape, whether that's just working with landowners, land changing hands, or different aspects of how the government interacts with a lot of private landowners. Another aspect of this is any climatological effects that we may be seeing on the landscape. But a lot of these layers are thinking about how climate may affect Lahontan cutthroat trout. There are different events like fire that may prevent us from expanding Lahontan cutthroat trout to where we would hope we would expand their range. And this is where the RAD framework, so resist, accept, direct, can support some of these management actions when we're thinking about changing landscapes and ecosystems. And so these are two papers by Dr. Abigail Lynch, who is with the USGS, and she's really championed the RAD framework over the past few years within the GS, and she really helped put together a lot of this information that I'm going to be sharing with you today. But how this framework is all created, a lot of it, I hope by the end of this, you're going to say, oh, okay, well, we're already doing this and it's not that new. So what's so radical about what you're sharing here? This is, something to provide a common lexicon and a path forward, especially given this is a listed species, right? Language and how we move forward with this really matters. So I want to first walk you through the different parts of the RAD framework, and I'll be providing an example of how this framework was already implemented for another fish species in Wisconsin, a walleye fishery, and I'll go into that a little bit more. And then I'm going to be giving you examples of how each part of RAD has already been implemented for LCT, but we may just not have the language to necessarily put those things in those boxes. And I just want to emphasize that there's no specific order that RAD needs to necessarily be applied when you're making a management action. You don't have to resist first and then start to accept or direct. You can choose one and keep that throughout this management action. If a change happens on the landscape, it may give you a new chance to change what part of the RAD framework you're using. So first, resist. Resist is a not new strategy, and none of these are really new, and I'll keep emphasizing that. But this is a common strategy that's often implemented on the landscape. And so the thought with resisting is that you're restoring conditions to some past historical baseline. And this may be an option when transformation on the landscape is very slow, so you're able to actually combat what's happening, or it can be used in more of a long-term strategy in order to buy time. And as I mentioned, this was a little bit hard for me to wrap my head around until I had an actual example for another fish species. And so what I'm going to be using as an example from some work that Colin Dassow from Wisconsin has been using for prioritization of Wisconsin walleye lakes. And so this is a map of Wisconsin, and all the gray polygons that you're seeing are these Wisconsin walleye lakes. And walleye are a cool water fish species. They're very sensitive to water temperature as well as dissolved oxygen, which is projected and has already been affected within these lake systems as water is increasing in temperature and dissolved oxygen is declining. And this walleye fishery is really important to the state of Wisconsin and many different stakeholders. It's a recreational fishery. It's important very culturally to both tribal and non-tribal members. And it's also used as a recreation or subsistence fishery. So there's many different aspects at play, just like with LCT. So the examples that I'm going to be giving are for different individual lakes. However, there are many lakes within the system that have a lot of the same attributes that are contributing to their decisions for a specific lake. So the example for the walleye lakes to resist or maintain the function of the lake without having any cross-hole threshing changes. So they're using different lines of evidence to make these choices, just like we would be for LCT. So for the specific lake, they have very strong natural recruitment. It's not projected to decrease any in the future. They also have these lakes that are supporting many different stakeholder groups. So it's important very culturally and socially. And then also the specific lake is not projected to have very large changes in temperature. And because of all of these, right, like generally positive things that are happening for these different lake systems, the thought is to resist any change that may happen in the future, given the economic importance of the specific lake and the small changes that are expected. So the next part of the framework is the accept. And accepting, there are a few important parts, right? The first is that this is a very conscious decision not to take a management action. It's not just stepping back, you have to choose to step back. And I think that's some of the conversations that we saw happening with a lot of the genetics work. And, you know, not surprisingly, and all of you have probably experienced this, right? The decision of accepting that this change is going to happen could be controversial, and it may look as a perception of inaction to many stakeholders. So for the Wisconsin walleye lakes, they're, you know, accepting change, and in some cases, this change may even be desirable by stakeholders. So that is something to keep in mind. So for the specific chain of lakes, there was warming water temperatures projected, and it's already happening on the landscape. Adult survival was not supported to project into the future and has even been declining in recent years. And in projections that they have, natural recruitment is not supposed to be supported into the future either. So for these specific lakes, they're accepting that this change is going to happen. They will have recruitment failure, knowing that these populations may not persist there. So finally, and potentially the most confusing part of the RAD framework is direct state. And so directing means that you're taking management actions in order to change the trajectory of the system. And this may even include, you know, letting new species start to take hold in the area that you're thinking about. And this is completely a value-based judgment. And the important aspect between direct and accept is that this is perceived to be worth the effort to direct to the ecosystem to a different state versus just accepting what's going to happen on the landscape. So for this Wisconsin walleye lakes, again, this is the thought where you go through and you say, well, resisting for this specific list of attributes that we have is very unrealistic. And accepting, well, you know, maybe we can do something different. So there's this opportunity to push change to a more desirable state, depending on what your management outcomes are. So for example, in one of these lakes, the walleye catch has been decreasing over recent years. The panfish catch has been increasing. And when they look more broadly about lakes in relation to this specific lake, they're seeing that a lot of the surrounding lakes have strong walleye fisheries. And so thinking about shifting this specific lake to mainly support panfish is not necessarily going to have as much of an effect on their stakeholders as probably the time and effort they would need to actually resist this change from happening at all. And in this case, for this specific walleye fishery, directing it to this panfish fishery was actually a positive outcome for a lot of their stakeholders. That was very supportive to have this alternative opportunity for recreational angling or for harvesting. So stepping back again, right, we have these three parts of the RAD framework. And, you know, I gave you this example. It's already been applied for a lot of these lakes in Wisconsin. But, you know, I want to contextualize it within LCT and provide some examples of how this is already being applied on the landscape, even though we're not necessarily using this language. So first, for resisting, this is a great example. And, you know, Jason highlighted this in his talk the other day, the Independence Lake system. So in this lake, there was lots of work to remove brook trout, but then after all of that work, right, there was found to be hybrid LCT in that system. And so this is a great example of how they're resisting the continued hybridization of LCT by implementing a weir during the spawning run and only passing those fish that are pure up in order to spawn. And so this is a state where we can say, hey, you know, maybe we didn't have this necessary language to put for the specific management action, but this is an opportunity where we value resisting that hybridization because this is an important population. So the next example within LCT habitat, I want to point to the accept. And a great example here is the cannon fire that came through Mill Creek area in 2002. And the pictures on the right side of the slide here are showing what this looked like right after the fire ripped through. And these are pictures that Chad took. And, you know, they did not do any sort of intervention in this area. And just, you know, a few months later, 6 months later, in September, we start to see some of the vegetation coming back. You know, just 3 years later, we're seeing some willows come into the area. And this is a picture that Robert took in 2021, so almost 20 years after the fire, which is important to point out, right? That time frame with accepting how we get to this state. But we see that, you know, there's a beaver complex, there's lots of willows. You know, it seems like the floodplain is connected in this area. So accepting doesn't necessarily mean that the ecosystem state is going to be worse than how we found it, right? So that is one thing to keep in mind about that action. And then finally, the direct part of this framework. This is an example that Cody and Jacob provided for me. And, you know, this is an example of an event that happened that actually provided an opportunity to direct the state into a different way. And so there was some mining happening of the North Fork Humboldt, and the drill actually punctured the aquifer, which drained a large extent of the stream. But because of that event, there was a lot of mitigation money that resulted, and that mitigation money led to a fish barrier, which then led to the isolation of pure LCT above that barrier, providing an opportunity for this species. And then in addition to that, with that money and different partnerships with private landowners, they were able to leverage all of this mitigation money in order to a road-known project that was somewhat successful in 2017 and 2019, and even do some restoration work. And so some of these events that may be happening on the landscape, whether it's human caused or not, may give us an opportunity to direct these ecosystems into a different state that we wouldn't have had the opportunity to do before. So stepping back again, right, we have these different parts of the RAD framework. It's supposed to be simple, right? You only have 3 choices, but we all know from the past few days, there's a lot of uncertainty with the data sources that we have. And if we really think about it, right, there's uncertainty within our actions. There's only 3, but there's not necessarily a prescription for what you should be choosing. This should be based on, social or management outcomes, or a combination of all of those. And then within this, right, we know that there's climatic uncertainty. Even though we have all these different layers, are going to be producing all these different layers, those may change, right? This science is always adapting. And then we do have that social uncertainty, whether lands are going to change hands, whether people want to continue working with you. That's very important to understand. And then finally, for LCT especially, right, thinking about this in a political framework or from the end of just law in general, what are these actions going to mean for a listed species? That is something that, we're going to need to understand and take into account if this is something that's implemented for LCT. But, to point out, this is something that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is already implementing, but it's on national wildlife refuges. So, it's not necessarily comparative to what we would potentially be doing, but it's actually, it's at least in U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service toolbox. And, with all of this uncertainty, it points to whether this can actually be adaptive. And so this is just a conceptual model of some examples of how RAD can be used based on different changes on the landscape. So on the x-axis is time here, and on the y-axis is your system state. And you'll see the black line is just representing some system variability. And you'll have some transformational change that's always happening on the landscape, but it gets to the point where we start, potentially tipping thresholds. And when you see that threshold happen, that's when you would implement RAD and you would make this decision within this framework. And the important point is, as I mentioned before, is that, you don't necessarily have to go resist first and then accept and then direct. And even when you choose one of these different actions, depending on how quickly the change is happening on the landscape or whether your management outcomes are actually being achieved, you can change which part of RAD you want to choose. So this is made to be integrated into adaptive management. And depending on how quickly your transformational forcing may be happening, you may need to be making these RAD decisions at different rates. So like I mentioned before, what I really hope you take away from this is, right, it's relatively simple, but we still obviously have a lot to think about if we were to integrate all these different data sources and use RAD. But it gives us a common lexicon, which of course is very important if we're going to be implementing this for an ESA listed species, right? That language matters and having consistency matters. But within this common lexicon, there are ways to adapt to change and apply this in a way that is actually useful for managers on the landscape. So what I want to end with here is, this is just a gentle introduction to the RAD framework and, hoping to open this up to a lot of feedback, any, different reservations that anyone has or any positive interactions with using this possibility in other ways. We're hoping to hear that feedback. And so, that's all today is, but, in between this interagency meeting and the next, right, we're going to be collecting more of the genetic data. We're going to be understanding more of these social aspects that we need to understand and collecting more of the habitat data that will feed into this framework. So at the next interagency meeting, I think Sean's vision that we've talked about is, after we collect more of these data, and it may not be exhaustive in every piece that we necessarily need, but we can start to understand how the data will be used to inform RAD. And, that will be a point where we need to start having conversations about what thresholds within genetic data, within habitat data, within social interactions that, need to be prioritized even within RAD. And then, in between, use RAD to decide management decisions or actions on the landscape. And, sometime in the somewhat near future, actually apply RAD on the landscape to start to prioritize restoration or relocation of LCT. So that's all I have for today. I'm happy to field any questions. It would be really great if Sean was here too. But I think, between all of us, we can probably help answer most of the questions maybe anyone has.
All right, there's a chat while they're closing things up. Oh, I just lost it.
So I don't know if you want to read
Yeah.
that.
So Jason says, Haley, this is a nice rollout of the RAD framework, giving us the quote words for dealing with transformation. One stealth form of transformation, maybe not the audience here, is also changing land ownership and changing landowner values. Work by Julia Haggerty et al. Points to this. Coming to realize this has changed my view. We also have an example of RAD applied to decision alternatives that are similar to LCT, but looking at the issue of brook trout versus bull trout. I like your description of RAD. No need to unmute. All right. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, and I think, that is an important aspect, right? Changing land ownership could prevent you from continuing certain management actions or give you the opportunity to make those management actions. And so this is dynamic, right? It's state and space. We can't just think about one without the other.
Sorry. We kind of talked about this earlier, but I was just curious on like how this framework has been applied to listed species, given that like, for example, like Lahan cutthroat trout are, we're supposed to conserve technically regulatorily wherever found. And so how this framework can be applied from just kind of addressing those regulatory hoops that may kind of not really like that accepting type framework. I mean, I love this stuff, it's great, but just how realistic is it for listed species?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Most of the work that I'm familiar with RAD has to do with what Abigail Lynch has really come up with the past few years. But that is that's a hurdle. That is something that's going to need to be realized and dealt with. But I think the biggest point is those decisions are already being made. There's just not explicit written, recording about it. Leaf has a probably nice comment that'll help me out.
I guess I just have a question here. You
Yeah.
mentioned climate, so in the sagebrush, we're applying this a lot, looking at where we can have durability in our conservation actions moving forward. And I've been in and out, so I may have missed it, but how is climate being incorporated into decisions for lawn, cutthroat trout, vegetation management, habitat management, things like that? Because if we're gonna choose to direct or choose to resist, how do we know that we're gonna have that durability for more than 2 years, especially in the face of, increased fires and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Leaf, and you definitely hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of what we're missing here is the context from Faith and Jason and others that we're supposed to talk today about more of the thinking about climate in relation to LCT. So you didn't necessarily miss anything. We just weren't able to necessarily address it today. But that is something, very much in the forefront in everyone's minds. And I think I'd like to, if you can give the mic to Faith, I think she can probably speak more to that than the specifics at least.
Yeah, that's definitely something we've been thinking about. I was gonna give a talk on that today, but we're gonna move to a virtual workshop just so we can go into a little bit more detail. But we kind of did what Daniel Isaac did for bull trout, delineating that like climate shield, climate refugia habitat. We already are in the works of applying that to Lahan cutthroat trout, and we've been collaborating with NDOW partners to kind of get that in a place where it works for LCT.
Thanks, Faith. Yeah, Nick.
Just a comment. It seems to me that one of the most useful parts is the accept part. And back to the endangered species, I think often that is the default. No, it's the status quo, no action. It is accept for endangered species for a lot of people, because a lot of people are so risk averse, they don't want to do anything that could jeopardize a species, because they don't want it to happen on their watch. And so, hey, let's just accept the status quo and keep moving forward. This makes you explicitly say that. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, that was Nick Bowes. Thank you.
This is Cody. A couple of comments, on the accept. We mentioned yesterday from when the 5-year review started to get, or we started drafting it to then when it got signed this week, we lost at least 2 populations in the Humboldt on it during that over the last year on it, and confirmed that with multiple sampling events and sampling techniques on it. Looking at the timeline, though, short term right now, we've had to accept those results on it. Doesn't mean that that's going to be the long-term approach for those populations. But when we balance, our capacity where we have to prioritize our efforts and stuff, short term, we have to accept that we lost those 2 populations on it. Now, during that same time, we're taking the combination of resisting and directing resources in Mary's River and kicking off a large multi-year, multi-agency, multiple landowner effort in that area on it. And that's an area that we've prioritized and have identified that we can't lose those populations there on it for both the short term and long term on it. Now, how that's going to shake out in the whole RAD framework and stuff to be determined. Right now, we know that it in the current state is some type of blending of probably all 3 of the resist, accept, direct decision matrix.
Can I chime in? I was just thinking this will be really helpful, Cody and others who are the RIT team leads, as we think through, the development of the conservation action plans for each management unit. I mean, essentially, without saying these words, it is kind of the thought process that people are going to have to go through, because it's like, all things being equal, you could have a meta population in this place, or this place. Oh, this place is determined not to be climate resilient based on the layers, or this place, there, all that information is swirling. And this gives us a way and a vocabulary to kind of name it and talk about it better, I think. That's
Um,
it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Laura. And then Jason just added in the chat. I don't know if you can read it because I definitely couldn't if I were in the audience. He said, even for ESA listed species, we're already doing this for the Oregon chub. Many of the actions that led to delisting would be described as direct, not exciting. It works, but the RAD core categories are aren't always clearly distinguishable.
There's nothing else online.
Alrighty. Great. Thanks.
Thanks, Haley. Well, to wrap things up, we have Kendall, who I'm looking around the room for closing remarks. There he is coming up here. And then after Kendall gives closing remarks, I'll probably hop back on here real quick to go over plans for the short-term action plan workshop this afternoon for folks. So here's Kendall.
All right, thanks, Cody. So Bill Duncanberger was on deck here to provide kind of some closing comments to you. And unfortunately, a few things came up on Bill's side. So tag on that. So sorry, guys, you'll have to live with me. But I do have some notes here I'll go over that Bill wanted to provide. To begin with, though, I just want to thank everybody in this room, everybody on screen. I've counted here, we've had 40 to 50 people in these rooms over the past 2 days. Wonderful output, especially given the weather. And I think we've had maybe 60, 70 people online. So, that's a great audience. And, it kind of shows the importance of this kind of work. So major thanks to the participants here, both internally, those that braved the storm, and externally for sitting in on the technological difficulties that always happen during these hybrid meetings. But thanks a bunch, guys. I also want to give major thanks to all the presenters, the RITs, good information. We need that kind of stuff. The science updates, habitat core teams, the database team, the genetics, all great work. And, it helps us come on board with this shared vision of how we can move forward towards recovery of the species in the future. Takes these types of forums for us to have that shared vision, for us to all come on the same page. We can't see that vision out there unless we're working all state, federal, private entities working together, nonprofits. We all got to work together. And these are the types of forums that I think are super important for us to get to that goal. A lot of these topics, well, the last in-person meeting we had was 2020, 2019, I don't know, something like that, pre-COVID. And we had a lot of these same type of topics during that forum. And, at the time I remembered sitting in the room listening, and it was kind of like scratch my head. Where does this fit into the picture? Well, it's kind of like building a house. We started back in those days with kind of that framework, that foundation, and everybody's looking around going, gee, what's this going to really look like? Slowly over the years, we've been adding the walls, and now we've added the roof to it, and we can start seeing what that house looks like. We can start seeing that collective nature of how all this work is moving together towards recovery. And I got to tell you, I'm starting to see that vision. I'm starting to see how things are working together to get to where we need to go. So that's really a key component to these forums and these meetings. Wow, I covered a lot of Bill's messages, even without looking at his messages, but nevertheless, couple other key points here that Bill wanted to mention is, you know, we've kind of taken a look at how the RITs are restructured in this calendar year. And, you know, I think that is going to closely tie into the UGOs, as well as bring the right people to the right places, you know, those voices to the table. And that's really the key part too, as we move forward as well. And, you know, from my perspective, the habitat work that we're putting together, that strategy, the monitoring strategy, that is going to be key for our land management agencies. So special kudos to all that, and integrating that across the land management boundaries, you know, not only BLM, Forest Service, but as well as private. Because again, we can't do everything if we're working in individual silos. So greatly appreciate that. Looking forward to seeing the outcome of a lot of this work. Starting to paint the walls of the house, maybe putting some windows on. You know, we're not there. We got a lot more work left to go, but we're headed the right direction. So I think I'll just end it with that, and we'll just pretend that all Bill's points were covered within my spiel of different logic here. So, so thanks a bunch, guys. Thanks for continuing.
Just a couple things to wrap up. Faith and Catlin have been busy the last 2 days taking notes and putting together highlights from some of the discussions, especially today on the workshops and stuff on it. So over the next couple of weeks, we will get that stuff captured and summarized along with PDFs of the presentations, and guess it'll be the first real test of the opinion box and the RIT communication structure and stuff to be able to share that information on it, and then provide that information to the larger interagency mailing list there on it. And then as Leaf and Matt went over in the CED discussion on it, we'll be entering that round 2 of the beta testing for the CED. So folks will be seeing that and their opportunities to work through the database there and collect feedback on how that's working on it. So any questions on that stuff? Laura?
Cody, people were asking, I typed in the chat because folks were asking me individually about the uploading of the meeting recording. And I said to them that I thought you guys were going to put it on Bin Box, but then I realized this whole interagency group doesn't necessarily have access to that Pinion Box. So do you have any thoughts on what you want to do? I told them to contact Rachel. She might kill me if 150 people all of a sudden ask her. Yes, she's going to kill me. See, bad. So what's the plan? Because we can't send it and there's not a cloud link. So it's got, maybe Sean could get it on one of the things he does with like a YouTube site or a Vimeo site or some of those other things. I don't really know.
You know, Laura, in the past, when we recorded the public meetings.
I can't hear you.
It was, so in the past, like when we had the public meetings a few years ago, I think we recorded them and ended up putting them on like a YouTube channel or something like that. I think that's the platform that we've used in the past for large recordings.
Okay.
I am not tech savvy. I don't know how to do that, but we can definitely explore how to make those really large recordings available.
Yeah, I figured Sean had a way. He'll know, I think, because of how we've done it. So ignore, so everyone who saw my chat, ignore it about contacting Rachel for access to the Pinion Box. We will find a different way to get that recording shared. And once we figure it out, we'll make sure email goes out to everyone with a link to access it.
Okay. And then for folks that want to stick around for the short-term action plan workshop, let's take a 20-minute break. So we'll get back together at 2:40, and everybody is welcome to participate in that. We highly encourage all the RIT leads, hopefully, to at least participate for part of it. Understand that some folks, have to travel back this afternoon on it. And plan is on that, we have a draft with 3 different types of projects for the Humboldt RIT to be captured in there: a habitat restoration, hybrid management, and a complete reintroduction project. And really the focus more on that conversation is going to be in the project description portions of the RAT. The RAT is a combination of a STAP and a RIT. To make sure that those portions in the project descriptions will meet all the other type of priority projects that folks may be working on in their respective RITs on it. And then we can also spend a little time on the actual outline and structure of the STAP, which is pretty basic format and stuff there on it. So that's
Yes, Catherine just asked in the chat. Yeah, just stay on this Zoom call. We're just going to keep the same platform going for this afternoon too.
Yeah,
Some
we're
folks
just going
in
to
the room and some folks on Zoom.
give us like 20 minutes to kind of let folks disperse and say goodbyes here and stuff on it. And then we might restructure the room a little bit to make it a little easier for a workshop type setting here on it.
And Cody, for folks that are joining online, I think you have hard copies of the example in the room. For folks online, will you be able to show?
Yeah, we got a digital that we'll pull up here and
Okay,
just
sweet.
use shared screen to work on.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Safe travels back home.
Thank you. Take care.
Hey, I'm just checking in.
If we can take like
5 more.
more minutes, yeah, to
Sure.
kind of got down to the core group here, and now we'll kind of figure out how we want to set things up on it. I thought 20 minutes was going to be enough, but not quite to get everybody out of the room, and I
No problem.
apologize to everybody on Zoom here. We'll be back shortly. Faith, are you okay with taking some general
Of course.
notes? I mean, there shouldn't be.
9,000 words, babe.
Are your fingers getting tired here? Mine would be. Check.
Cody, is Catlin still there too?
She just left.
Oh, I told her to head home. or
Okay.
Get out, yeah.
We'll just share the information with her.
Did you stop the recording, Lori?
No, I think it's still going. It's still going.
I don't know that we need to keep recording.
Okay.